Okay, another quick run through of the topic that you should have already covered, the second part of task 5, which is the behaviourist approach. Now, we've done this quite a bit. We've done this for attachment, learning theory explanations of attachment, and we've done this from phobias too. So hopefully this will be a strong one. Anything that crops up more than once on the course, really important that you know it well, and there's a lot of terminology with this. Okay, so the behaviourist approach, a response really to what had gone before it. You've got Freudian's ideas that were completely unscientific. You've got Wundt, who was, as we said, trying to follow a scientific method, but still questionable. They're saying to be scientific, you've got to deal with what's directly observable. And that's why you hear the phrase, the mind is an unnecessary concept. You can't directly observe it, therefore it's not scientific to try and do so. So behaviour is all that needs to be focused on, and yes, lab experiments are the main way of doing this. Behaviourists believe that we could generalise from animals to humans, so a lot of their studies were based on rats and pigeons and dogs and so on. Now, the two key terms which hopefully you're familiar and comfortable with now are classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So classical conditioning, the key word, get in your head, classical conditioning, learning by association. Now, I know sometimes students tie their heads and not trying to do this, but you've got the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. You pair a neutral stimulus, which of course will still bring about that response because it's paired with the unconditioned stimulus. You do that repeatedly, and then eventually, if what was the neutral stimulus brings about that response, it becomes what's called a conditioned stimulus, and the response is a conditioned response. I always find the easiest way to get that clear in my head is to think of Pavlov's dogs. So even if I'm not going to be writing about Pavlov's dogs, I find that as a useful reference point. So even people who haven't studied psychology usually have a good idea of Pavlov's dogs, its studies, and what that involved. So make sure you're aware of Pavlov's research. It's on the spec. You do need to be aware of what he did, and please be careful when you're using the terminology. Ideally, you do need to use all of this terminology, but as I said, students can sometimes get in a bit of a mess. Now, as I've said in one of my other videos, some of the questions on approaches may be a bit more broad than you might expect. Evaluate Pavlov's contribution to our understanding of behaviour. And yes, he did demonstrate how we can learn through association. We've got lots of research that he did to demonstrate this, and as we've talked about, this can be used for therapy. So it's got a practical application in the form of therapies for phobias. So we're linking back to what we did for abnormality, systematic desensitization, for example, learning a new association. So you've learned an association. How do you fix that? You learn a different one. Behaviourists believe what's learned can be unlearned. So that's what systematic desensitization is all about. And as we know, it can be effective. So we have to give credit to that his research helped our understanding of how we can learn through association, and we've subsequently applied that effectively to the treatment of phobias. But it could be argued, probably quite rightly, that this might be too simplistic an explanation for human behaviours, as we've talked about with phobias, and there may well be significant cognitive elements to all of this. And as we talked about with social learning theory, all those mediating cognitive factors really need to be taken into account. So his contribution to understanding of human behaviour maybe is partial, maybe it's limited. That yes, these things do play a role. We do have conditioned responses to things, but actually a lot of the time there are going to be the cognitive factors layered on top of that, taking it beyond the standard stimulus response that you'd get with animals. Okay, so that's Pavlov, and that's classical conditioning. And then you've got operant conditioning, which is learning through consequences, reward and punishment. Again, we talked about this a bit with social learning theory. You've got positive reinforcement, which is reward. Now, the opposite of that is punishment. A lot of students get this wrong. Negative reinforcement is still rewarding. It's, avoidance is the key word. So when you avoid something unpleasant, that's reinforcing. Okay, so again, more terminology here, which crops up in several topics, so do make sure you're clear on this. So ultimately, consequences is the key thing to have in mind. So Skinner, yes, Skinner We would have seen videos of him. There's many available if you want to have a look. So an example of what he did with the Skinner box, he'd have an animal. I've got that in the picture here, but pigeons, you've seen them tapping. There's a video where it looks like the pigeon can read, but it can't. It can just distinguish between two words, and it knows it learned that it gets food, and so it's being rewarded for performing those behaviours, and that's now shaped it to peck when it says peck and turn when it says turn. There's no thought process going on here. It's all as a result of operant conditioning. Okay, so if you asked about Skinner's box, that's what we're talking about. You can also demonstrate negative reinforcement, the avoidance here. Now, I know there's ethical question marks next to some of these studies and the treatment of the creatures there. I do prefer students don't go into that too much, because it tends to be a bit superficial with what they say. But yes, ultimately they are administering electric shocks to animals, but demonstrated how the animals soon learnt how to avoid that shock. There by pushing the lever, so therefore that's negative reinforcement through that reward of the avoidance behaviour. So that's Skinner's research. As we did earlier, his contribution to understanding human behaviour, well, we can't really ignore the role of positive and reinforcement and punishment and operant conditioning as a whole to humans within a school context. House points, merit marks, whatever you get. What did my sons get? Raffle tickets or something. It's all the same thing, trying to shape behaviour through reward. Obviously the opposite, detentions, is the punishment to try and stop that behaviour. You can also use it in other settings, so token economies, where you get a token for performing a behaviour which can then be exchanged for something later on that will be of value. So talking about my son's raffle tickets, they have a list of how many raffle tickets get you a certain thing. Now to you, it probably sound pretty naff, like sitting in a special chair or something for a day, but to an 8-year-old, year 3, it's quite exciting. So that's a token economy system. They're being exchanged for something of value. So serves a purpose, has applications, so helps our understanding of human behaviour. This research has helped us to use these methods to try and shape human behaviour. But once again, it's where we were before. If you don't take into account the cognitive factors in all of this, then chances are it is too simplistic to give a comprehensive account of human behaviour. And that's where social learning theory builds upon this, taking this into consideration, but also looking at all those mediating cognitive factors that are involved as well. Now, that's talking about the individual people, and they are named on the spec, so you do have to be prepared to talk about Skinner and Pavlov. But also you might be asked to evaluate the behaviourist approach as a whole. So a lot of what we just talked about could be used here. You've got research evidence and plenty of it, but then you could raise the point of it being animal research and questioning the extent to which we can generalise this to humans. But then again, you could argue that we have got the Little Albert study, albeit 100 years old now, I think. Still, ultimately, that study did demonstrate these processes appearing to be effective, the classical conditioning of being effective on a human, a young child. Okay, so while maybe not completely convincing, you still could use that there, or you could just use that study to start off with as your support. It's up to you. We can talk about the effective application of this theory. So we talked about that already. Treating phobias. So you'll find this as we go through paper 2 and paper 3 content. A lot of the time, you're not learning unique material. It really helps to try and think, hold on a second, I know this from elsewhere. Okay, so almost recycling points for different topics. Higher level students can do that, and it actually saves you a job rather than trying to learn the multiple different points for different topics. Okay, so application of therapies, that's another strength of it. Yes, when it came to the scientific status of psychology, this approach really helped psychology to move on through the scientific approach, directly observable, empirical methods. We'll talk about that more in a separate research methods lesson. But this does mean that non-observable things couldn't be studied. So that's where the whole mind and the role of that isn't taken into consideration. So again, we've got the scientific process there, but significant question marks about whether it's giving us the true answer to human behaviour.